Even though exposure therapy is evidence-based, it might not work when you're healing the fearful avoidant attachment style. And I'm going to tell you why. I am Pauline and I am so happy you are here because exposure therapy or exposure response prevention therapy is the golden standard when it comes to OCD. And there is a big link, correlation between OCD, several subtypes of OCD, and the fearful avoidant attachment style. Relationship OCD, homosexuality OCD, moral OCD. A lot of the subtypes, especially the thought types of OCD, have a correlation with the fearful avoidant attachment style, which kind of means that you have a higher chance of having OCD when you have the fearful avoidant attachment style. This then leads to a lot of therapists noticing and maybe even diagnosing OCD and thinking what we need to do is exposure therapy because that is the golden standard for, or the gold standard for OCD. But this usually does not work and might even backfire when it comes specifically to fearful avoidance. And we are going to dive into why, because I just want you to get the absolute best help possible when you're healing the fearful avoidant attachment style. So the main reason that exposure therapy might not work and can even backfire with fearful avoidance is that the underlying fear under these subtypes of OCD is relational. There is a lot of trauma in relationship, in attachment to your parent, and it's different than the other two insecure attachment styles, where the anxious preoccupied did have a sense of safety. It was just sometimes it was there and sometimes it wasn't. And the dismissive avoidant had kind of a disconnect, but not necessarily an unsafe feeling. But the fearful avoidant had definitely an unsafe feeling with a parent that was supposed to be their safe haven. So this is very generalized, black and white, and way too short about the other attachment styles. But the parent that was, for the fearful avoidant, the parent that was the supposed to be this sense of safety, and that was safety sometimes and was caring sometimes, was also the source of threat. That is very core to the fearful avoidant attachment style, and that leads to you having a hard time trusting or surrendering to a therapist, sometimes even just to other people. There's always this distrust, this hesitation, hypervigilance. And this matters because in exposure therapy, you're trying to break the pattern of compulsion, of trying to get relief by compulsive behavior or thoughts, by exposing yourself to a trigger in a safe environment. And that last part is why this is so important. Exposure therapy works on the premise of the therapist providing a safe environment and a safe relationship. So you are exposed to the trigger, but the therapist is there to provide a safe environment and to talk you through it and to coach you through it. And that works for so many people. I mean, it's not a question of whether exposure therapy works. It's, like I said, it's gold standard, it's evidence-based, it's an amazing form of therapy. But when the trauma is relational and when other people can be a threat, the whole foundation kind of shakes. And you don't completely feel safe with a therapist. That's not wrong. That's not a bad thing. It's just something that a lot of therapists miss, that are very well intentioned and probably are very well trained in exposure therapy. So it works, for instance, with things like the fear of spiders, the fear of heights, the fear of public speaking, with driving, all of that. It works very well with, but that is not necessarily interrelational attachment based. And so the presence of a safe person can actually help you to not go into compulsions. Um, but that doesn't work like that for the fearful avoidant attachment style, because there's complex PTSD. And thank goodness there's more and more knowledge about this, and more therapists know that when there's complex PTSD, uh, exposure therapy is not necessarily the gold standard, or shouldn't be the first choice. But it also still gets missed a lot, because they see OCD symptoms and they think, oh, that's exposure therapy. So um, when you're in therapy and your therapist proposes exposure therapy, make sure to ask more questions. Make sure to ask them whether they have heard of exposure therapy not working as well for complex PTSD, especially if you already know that you're a fearful avoidant. Bring that up and talk to them about it. I would love for you to have a therapist who actually knows about the fearful avoidant attachment style. But even when therapists have heard of it, they're not completely educated on what it exactly is, and that complex PTSD is at the core of it, and that therefore the whole premise on which exposure therapy is built doesn't really work the same way. Again, I'm not saying exposure therapy doesn't work or it's not a good therapy. It is. There's amazing therapists and you can get amazing results. But specifically for the fearful avoidant attachment style, it really can also not work and backfire. And then also, when you're just using, so what can happen is that when you're using exposure therapy and you don't feel completely safe with your therapist, and they might not even be very aware of that, you get triggered, because that's the whole idea. You create a trigger, and then instead of the safety of the therapist being there, you don't feel safe, because all of a sudden you feel vulnerable while being in the presence of another person, which is also triggering. And then you get out of that session just being triggered, and sometimes even re-traumatized. I have definitely heard stories of people having gone through that. And I just want you to know that when that happens, it's not your fault. You didn't do it wrong. It's not that you're completely broken. It's just that you didn't get the form of therapy that you need, and that works really well for fearful avoidance. And then also, besides this point about exposure therapy, the other thing that I've been noticing is that exposure therapy doesn't release necessarily the emotional charge. It builds tolerance, and it increases behavioral flexibility, which means that you don't, out of a reflex, kind of go into old behaviors. But that's hard also to kind of practice that, because then it comes down to willpower and discipline, and that is just really hard with the triggers being so intense and so overwhelming. I remember when being triggered, it just felt like an avalanche had hit me, that I was drowning. It was just all consuming. It was so intense, and I think that's what a lot of people in general miss, that being triggered is not the same for everyone, and being able to choose differently in the moment, which a lot of well-intended therapists try to teach fearful avoidance, it's just not a possibility. There's You don't have the choice of reacting in a different way, because this attachment style is so physical and so visceral, and there's so much stored trauma that those reflexes are just really strong and overwhelming. So what you want to have also is a modality or a tool or a form of therapy that can release that emotional charge. And what I mean by that is that when you're triggered by whatever it is, feelings come up. And those feelings that you have are usually completely tied to what you've went through when you were a child. So for instance, you you feel rejected, and all of a sudden all these feelings come rushing in that you had when you were younger and you were rejected. And so you try to choose differently in that moment. That's really hard with all these overwhelming feelings. But when you remove the emotional charge, so the feelings that come up when you get triggered by feeling rejected, then in a other situation, a new situation where you get rejected or you feel like you're rejected, you don't have these emotions coming up, all these feelings coming up, and it feeling so overwhelming. That's what I mean with releasing the emotional charge and releasing the stored trauma from your body. So exposure therapy definitely has its place. It is a gold standard. It is evidence-based. It is a really good form of therapy. But when it comes to the fearful avoidant attachment style, and the complex trauma that is always, linked to that and underneath that, exposure therapy might not be the best way. So just to not leave you hanging, what is a very good therapy that actually helps? I healed 95% of my fearful avoidant attachment style with the emotional freedom technique. And I don't want to come off as emotional freedom technique is just always better and it will work. And it really is your journey. And all I want is to just help you on your journey and make sure that you know that when a form of therapy doesn't work, that there are other ways. If EFT doesn't end up helping you, there are other ways to heal. And the fact that it doesn't help you doesn't mean that you are doing it wrong. That's just what I really want you to take from this video. So I made a whole video on EFT, on the emotional freedom technique. Watch that. Again, I'm not saying that is the only way to heal. I just really want to help you on your healing journey and kind of make, the fearful avoidant attachment style in and of itself is overwhelming, right? And then the whole healing journey with all the therapies that are possible can be overwhelming too. So that's why I make these videos. Okay. I am so happy you are here. I want to know if this was helpful for you. Let me know in the comments below whether it was. And I was going to say I'm going to see you in the next one. Normally these are one takes, these videos. But did you notice that at some point my son was crying? He's a baby. He's 1.5. And I had to stop the video, and I thought I was going to come back and finish it, but it's the next day now, so my hair is different. Everything's different. Maybe you've noticed because I know you're very observant. But yeah, I'm really happy you're here, and I will see you in the next one.